So hello and welcome back. I hope that you're all refreshed and if you're anything like me with a tea in hand, ready and raring to get stuck into the nitty-gritty of today's conference. So as I mentioned before the break, let me just quickly reintroduce her. I would now like to invite Helen Harwatt, who is a Senior Research Fellow of the Energy, Environment and Resources Programme at Chatham House, to take the floor, and Helen's going to present a Chatham House study on the impact of food systems on biodiversity loss. And just before she kicks off with her presentation, just a quick reminder to be sure to submit all your questions for Helen as we go along, as this presentation will be followed by a short Q&A session. So without further ado, Helen, the floor is yours.
Brilliant. Thank you, Natasha. And thanks everybody for joining. It's great to be here. And as Natasha mentioned, I'm going to be taking us through the food and farming transformation that's necessary to include in climate and biodiversity plans. I'm going to look at each of those issues separately and really bring in a sort of medley of the research, some of which I've been involved in as well, before bringing those issues back together in a solutions section and looking at an example of what we might expect some of those solutions to actually deliver. And definitely bear with the presentation. It gets much more positive towards the end, despite the difficult beginning. So let's start with climate change. So I think it's really worth pointing out actually that climate change is considered by the World Health Organization as the greatest threat to global health this century. So we're really not just looking at a purely environmental issue here. It's a massive global health issue as well. And the context for climate change is that we currently have around 78%, really the absolute bulk of emissions coming from G20 members. We have global temperature rise already above 1 degree above pre-industrial levels, and that temperature rise is already having negative impacts. The IPCC published the 1.5 degrees report in 2018, and what they found is that if temperatures go up to 1.5 degrees, the impacts would be worse than they are at current temperatures, but not as bad as if they go up to 2 degrees. So there's certainly a trajectory there in terms of temperature rise and the impacts that we might see. And they also found that the impacts would be greater if temperatures overshoot 1.5 degrees and then come back down to 1.5 degrees at some point, which is being discussed in various policy contexts as well. And that is because doing so, allowing temperatures to go over 1.5 degrees, could actually set in motion a range of ecosystem destabilization. So just to demonstrate that, you can see here those yellow circles indicate the ecosystems that are at risk of destabilization up to 3 degrees, and the red ones up to, the orange ones around 3 to 5 degrees. So these are on the kind of temperature trajectory that we're heading towards, and you can see that there are major ice sheets and forest systems and coral reefs involved. So the best option in terms of the Paris Agreement would be to adhere to the precautionary principle and the equity component of the Paris Agreement, which would require 1.5 degrees or limiting temperature to 1.5 degrees with no overshoot. And this would require a 45% in CO2 emissions by 2030. So that is a massive amount over less than a decade, and also going down to net zero by 2050. So the progress report, we have greenhouse gas emissions rising by around 1.5 degrees per year in the last decade. So this is obviously pre-COVID. CO2 from energy use in industry hit a record high in 2018, and the current pledges to the Paris Agreement would actually take us above 3 degrees of warming above pre-industrial levels. And the chances of actually meeting the Paris Agreement goals could actually be depleted over the next decade. So this coming year, where countries are revising their commitments to the Paris Agreement, is really the final opportunity to bring those pledges in line with the goals of the Paris Agreement. So the coming decade is absolutely crucial for climate change. So what's needed? Countries actually need to increase their ambitions 5-fold to limit to 1.5 degrees and 3-fold for 2 degrees. We need global emissions to peak, so that would actually have been 2020 for the 1.5 degrees goal, and a little bit later for the 2 degrees goal. We need that to be followed by strong and rapid reductions before 2030. And we also need enhanced longer term commitments. And essentially, if we delay action now, we need to rely much more on technologies in the future to remove emissions from the atmosphere. And currently those technologies are improving, and I'll come back to those in a little bit. And just to say on food, it's actually impossible to meet those climate goals if we don't factor in food. So food systems currently account for around 1/3 of greenhouse gas emissions globally. And on the current trajectory, that would roughly double by 2050. And a recent analysis actually found that even if fossil fuel emissions were immediately halted, the current trends in global food systems alone would prevent the achievement of the 1.5 degree goal. And just to break this down a little bit more, if we look at the livestock sector, so this is from analysis that I published in 2018, and I found that the livestock sector alone could use around half of the greenhouse gas budget for 1.5 degrees and around 37% for the 2 degrees budget by 2030. So these are really near timeframes. Technology can help to reduce these emissions somewhat, but certainly nowhere near the level needed. So reducing the production and consumption of animal products is absolutely unavoidable in this. And if we were to try and avoid doing that, it would essentially require other sectors to increase their mitigation efforts beyond anything that is planned or realistic. And just to really sort of emphasize that, if we look at the greenhouse gas budget, we currently have less than 10 years of current emissions remaining before we get to that 1.5 degrees temperature goal. So you can see here that there's really no wiggle room for any sectors to contribute strongly to this. And if we add on to that the need to actually remove significant amounts of CO2 from the atmosphere, in addition to reducing emissions strongly and rapidly on the ground, that really re-emphasizes this need for every sector to act strongly and rapidly. And just to talk a little bit more about that CO2 removal, so this is essential to limit temperatures to 1.5 degrees, and probably for 2 degrees as well. All of the options currently being explored do require large areas of land, and there are numerous challenges, in particular with the high-tech options. So one of the main options being discussed in policy circles is bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, which is essentially growing biofuels or crops such as miscanthus and transporting them to power stations and removing the CO2 before those emissions reach the atmosphere, and burying them underground in old geological formations. So as you can tell, this technology is very complicated and is definitely not proven at the scale that it would need to be operating at. And actually the only option that we currently have to remove emissions on a large scale is essentially to regrow vegetation where it's been removed. Of course, this also requires large areas of land, so we still need to look at where that land would come from. And this really brings in food quite strongly. So if we look at global land use, we can see that we're using around half of our land, habitable land, for agriculture. And the bulk of that is currently occupied by livestock production. And this is in exchange for relatively little contribution to the food system in terms of protein and calories, contributing around 18% of all calories globally and 37% of protein. So we definitely need to look at food in this context, and we certainly need to include that along with all of the sectors to tackle climate change. So moving on to biodiversity loss. So this is where I'll cover some points from the report that we published in February that Natasha mentioned at the start of the talk. And first of all, biodiversity loss is accelerating. The last round of biodiversity targets over the last decade were not met. We currently have around 25% of all species at risk of extinction, and a further somewhere close to 1 million more species facing extinction within decades. And a really key thing here is that biodiversity is absolutely essential for a habitable planet. So not only do we heavily rely on it for our shelter, food and water, for example, but also much more fundamentally, it plays a critical role in controlling temperatures. So currently terrestrial and marine ecosystems together remove around 60% of all CO2 that we emit into the atmosphere. So this really is critical for controlling temperatures, atmospheric global temperatures, and actually creating a habitable planet for us. These terrestrial systems and marine systems are currently the only major ways that we have of removing CO2 from the atmosphere. Food systems are a leading driver of biodiversity loss. So we currently have more than 1,000 species projected to lose around 25% of their habitats by 2050 under business as usual. And meat production and consumption accelerates habitat loss the most, threatening over 17,000 species. So certainly quite a gloomy picture. And one thing that we did in the report is to look at the food system in terms of its structures. So it's currently structured to essentially drive supply and demand, which is what we're calling the cheaper food paradigm in the paper. So essentially you can see here this set of kind of interlocking, overlapping, self-reinforcing mechanisms or vicious circles within the food system. And essentially the main goal is to increase food production at increasingly lower costs. And essentially what this does is require more and more land to be converted to agriculture, further intensifying farming methods, and also increasing the negative impacts in terms of environmental costs as well as we go. And an example of that is that grains have become cheap enough to feed to farmed animals in massive quantities, allowing the increased production and consumption of animal products globally. And what this really does is it incentivizes the supply of low-priced, calorie-dense, nutritionally poor foods. And in the context of the fact that we currently have around 3 billion with one or more manifestations of poor nutrition globally, which costs around 3.5 trillion per year. This is essentially, there's really nothing cheap about this system at all. And all of those costs are currently externalized. So the environmental damage and the health impacts, the costs of those are externalized onto society. And actually externalizing these costs in the name of kind of tackling food poverty and increasing food availability actually just increases the vulnerability of the marginalized over the longer term by further degrading the whole system that the food production relies on. And what we really need to do is bring people out of poverty so that they can actually afford food that covers its true environmental costs, and focusing on the foods that actually have much lower environmental costs, such as fruits and vegetables as well, making those more available. So we're just going to have a look at some of the main ways that the food system impacts biodiversity loss. So of course we have habitat loss and land clearance, which I'm sure is probably the most familiar issue or the one that you come across most often. So just to run through that briefly, agriculture is a direct driver of around 80% of deforestation globally. Animal agriculture is responsible for around 65% of all land use change since 1960, and is also linked to around 80% of deforestation in the Brazilian Amazon. And of course, forests are a natural carbon sink, that we've already covered that. And also there are really important repositories for biodiversity as well. So there's a really important link there between these two issues. It's also, the chemical pollution is a major issue for biodiversity. So for example, this is pesticides and fertilizers and manure being used on farmland, polluting the land and also working its way into waterways and causing issues such as eutrophication and leading to dead zones as well. We also have a prevalence of monocultures. So not only are these really poor for biodiversity in terms of crop diversity. So for example, in the UK, we have 91% of our cropland going to just 7 crops, but they're also really poor in terms of providing a range of different habitats and opportunities for a wider range of species. So it really just becomes quite a poor area in terms of supporting biodiversity. There's also the direct killing of animals, for example, wolves that are seen to predate on livestock are removed, and also other aspects. So, for example, badger culling in the UK, where badgers are culled as they're seen to actually spread disease between cattle, for example. So there are various different ways, and obviously when land is cleared as well, so there's a massive issue in Queensland with the clearance of forests and killing of wild animals in that process as well. And of course, we have climate change, which the food system contributes to in quite a major way. And climate change affects wildlife or biodiversity in a range of different ways. So for example, it can cause species to actually migrate and have to go to different areas to live. And this could bring them into contact with other species and also compete more for food and water. And there are obviously impacts such as wildfires as well, which would impact them directly. And just to point out that animal agriculture has the biggest across all of these issues in terms of land use, chemical pollution, and climate change in exchange for very little contribution to the food system, as we've already seen. And just to go into that a little bit more, so really one of the major ways that the livestock sector has such a disproportionate impact is that it's very inefficient to produce. So for example, to produce 1 calorie of beef requires 37 calories of plants to produce that calorie of beef. Pork requires 12 calories, chicken 9 calories, and eggs and dairy each require 6 calories of plants. And globally, around or more than a third of all crop calories globally are fed to farmed animals, and only around 12% of those calories come back as human edible food. So we're losing there over a third of all crop calories produced before that reaches anybody's plates. And an analysis published in 2018 looking at the US found that if US cropland was actually reconfigured away from livestock feed to foods that actually are optimum for human health and using least environmental resources, that same area of land could actually feed more than around twice as many people as it currently does. So we can see here that there's a really big loss of resources, a really big efficiency issue with the livestock sector as well. So moving on to the solutions section, where we will kind of join these two issues together a bit more. So these are some of the solutions that we identified in the recent biodiversity paper, what we call the key elements or the key levers to food system transformation. So we have these two first ones on food, shifting to plant-based diets, which really reduces the burden across the board, as we've already seen. We also have food waste. So food waste currently, we waste around a third of all food produced. So that's clearly a massive intervention area to tackle. And then we also have a couple of land-based levers. So first of all, preserving existing habitats, which requires us not to actually further extend agricultural land into pristine ecosystems. But also we really need to restore lost habitats and carbon sinks. As we've seen, we need to remove massive amounts of emissions from the atmosphere. And right now, the only option on the table is to do that through natural ecosystem regeneration. And we also need to produce food differently. So we need to produce food much less intensively and in a much more nature-friendly way. And it's worth pointing out here that really the sort of the level that we shift to plant-based diets really determines what we can do in terms of those land and farming options, because that shift to plant-based would really free up the land. This is the crucial part, the land that is actually needed in order to restore those ecosystems or to produce food in more nature-friendly farming ways, which tends to require more land to do that. So just to have a look at some of the potential policy pathways to start to really kind of get us on the right trajectory in the food system. So this is an article that I published in 2018 where I put forward a 3-step strategy, and we actually expanded on this in 2019 and put it out as a call to policymakers in high income and middle income countries ahead of COP25. And what the 4 key steps that we were calling for action on were to peak livestock production, set reduction targets in those countries, and shift to plant-based alternatives, and finally to restore native ecosystems. And currently we have over 100 scientists globally who've actually signed our call to action in support of those 4 key steps. And that was thanks to the Animal Law and Policy Program at Harvard Law School, who actually facilitated that for us. So the peak livestock aspect. So we currently have around a 3-fold increase in livestock production over the last 60 years. So the first step in this really is to peak livestock production. The second step, and that's peaking across all species of livestock production. So the second step is to set reduction targets against that livestock production, and this could be done using a West first approach. So we could identify that based on the highest emitters or the highest land users, or those which have the lowest sort of output to input ratios. And just to give you an idea what that looks like globally, if we took this West first approach on greenhouse gas emissions, we could see there that beef actually contributes the most greenhouse gas emissions, contributing around 6% of all global greenhouse gas emissions, followed by dairy milk at around 4% of all global greenhouse gas emissions. So that would be the sort of worst first list globally if we were to look at it from a greenhouse gas perspective. But of course, if we look at this on a national level, this could vary depending on what that production inventory was like in that given country. Or similarly, if we looked at it from a kind of institutional or city or food service perspective, it would also vary depending on what the food procurement makeup basically. So shifting to plant-based alternatives is the third step. So this, what we're calling best available food approach, would essentially replace those livestock products with the best available food to maximize greenhouse gas reductions, minimize other environmental impacts, and maximize positive health outcomes. And that term really is borrowed from the pollution control industry, where they use best available technology to deal with pollution issues. So we're essentially just applying that same thing to food. And pulses are likely to be really important in this shift, but also I think, especially in the kind of transitional stages, it might also be worth thinking about meat alternatives as a best available food in some context, where there are expectations in society for these sorts of products, especially in those early stages, like I said. And these products do have significantly lower environmental impacts compared to livestock alternatives as well. So we'd still be seeing reductions. And the final step is the restoration of carbon sinks. So this is really to its maximum sequestration potential. So we're not talking about timber plantations, for example. We're talking about native regeneration of forest cover, for example. And there are clearly additional benefits here to biodiversity as well by recreating some of those lost habitats, and also helping to achieve that really significant CO2 removal goal that we saw earlier on as well. And just to finish, I want to give an example of what that could look like if we actually went through those steps, and what that might actually deliver in terms of contributing to climate change goals. So this is an analysis that we published last year. And what we essentially did is to look at returning permanent pasture land and animal feed cropland to its native ecosystem cover, which in this case was either grassland or forest, depending on what would actually naturally occur in that area. And this gave us the carbon opportunity cost of animal agriculture, which is essentially what would actually occupy that land if we removed livestock, or what was there before the livestock were occupied, the land was cleared for livestock essentially. So we looked at the carbon opportunity costs, and also what would actually happen, or what that land would be returned to under these 3 dietary scenarios. So we looked at a business as usual up to 2050. We looked at an Eat Lancet diet, which is around 70% reduction in meat consumption compared to business as usual. And we also looked at a fully vegan diet up to 2050. So this is what the carbon opportunity cost looks like spatially. And the darker colours are essentially the most dense carbon sequestration spots. So you can see there how that is spread out globally, and even areas such as Ireland that we currently think of as being very green could be quite a whole lot greener under this kind of reforestation or regeneration scenario. We looked at where this sequestration would actually occur across income groups as well. And this for me was probably the most interesting aspect, because we found around 70% of that global potential actually occurs in high and upper middle income countries. So if we think about earlier on where we saw the G20 were actually responsible for by far the bulk of emissions, actually the higher income countries could also take a massive lead on removing emissions from the atmosphere through ecosystem restoration. As we can see here, those countries account for around 70% of that potential. And the 3 dietary scenarios are shown here. And as we can see, business as usual over at the far side would actually require more land to be converted to agriculture up to 2050, resulting in further loss of natural carbon sinks. And this is mainly due to the requirement for animal feed up to 2050, despite us actually applying the most ambitious yield projections up to 2050. So we can see the Eat Lancet would actually give around the equivalent to, or it would remove the equivalent to around 9 years of current global CO2 emissions from the atmosphere under that 70% less meat diet up to 2050. And if we go to the full end of the vegan spectrum, in terms of dietary shift, that would extend the emissions reduction or removal to around 16 years worth of current CO2 emissions that would be removed from the atmosphere under that dietary scenario by 2050. So I just want to show some of the benefits, the kind of collective impacts of these sorts of transformation. So if we look at climate change, in addition to removing CO2 from the atmosphere, as I just demonstrated, there would actually be quite a significant reduction in food-related greenhouse gas emissions, around 70% of non-CO2 emissions. And then, of course, we have the somewhere around 16 years worth of current CO2 emissions removed from the atmosphere as well by restoring native ecosystems. And also the time frame is really important in this. So we have the annual savings, the 70% reduction, for example, which would no longer need to come from the emissions budget. we have the short-term impacts on temperature rise from removing significant amounts of methane from the atmosphere. So I didn't really get a chance to talk about this earlier on, but the livestock sector is responsible for most methane emissions globally, and methane has essentially a shorter temperature, a shorter term impact on temperature compared to CO2. So actually reducing methane could actually help to avoid taking us up to those temperature tipping points around 1.5 degrees. And we also have the long-term impacts on temperature of removing CO2 removal. So that analysis that I just demonstrated was around a 30-year time horizon to actually achieve that CO2 removal. And if we look at the impacts on biodiversity, we could expect to have somewhere around a 70% reduction in terms of the land use requirements under these food system shifts, and also around half of the eutrophication impact as well. And again, just to point out that it's really the shifting of the production and consumption of animal products that are the most crucial enabling element to delivering those impacts across climate and biodiversity. And I think as well, one thing that we haven't really had time to go into is the kind of well-being aspect. So there's an increasing body of literature now on the well-being impacts of spending time in nature. And I think this element is really crucial to bring into these kind of transformation scenarios to actually see what that would also deliver from that perspective as well. And just to wrap up, so really the main thing to emphasize here, of course, is the urgency of both of these issues in terms of tackling climate change and temperature rise, but also tackling biodiversity loss. So these two issues really need to be tackled strongly and rapidly. And the clock is certainly ticking on this, of course. And as I just mentioned, some of those impacts would not be delivered in full until around 30 years' time. So we really need to get started on these pathways immediately. And there are some really promising opportunities coming up to be able to do that. So as I mentioned earlier, we have the nationally determined contributions, which is essentially every country's commitment to meeting the Paris Agreement. So these will be revised this year, towards the end of this year. And this really is an opportunity for some of these transformative aspects to be included and set those commitments in motion. In addition to the COP26 for climate change, we also have a number of other key events this year. So we have the Convention on Biological Diversity, COP15, where countries will essentially commit to the next 10 years worth of biodiversity goals. So another really key opportunity to embed some really significant and meaningful goals into policy. And in addition to these sort of global level multilateral processes, there's also many things that can actually be done at the national level in terms of food policy, health, farming, biodiversity, climate change, and other environmental policies. So in the UK, for example, we have the National Food Strategy, which is currently in the process of drafting, as far as I know. So we have many, and obviously our farming policy is in the process of being revised following removal of the cap. So there are essentially lots of different opportunities going on to bring these issues into policy quite strongly and soon as well. And of course, in that we do expect to see subsidy shifts and the provision of incentives being quite key in achieving that. So some of the key recommendations from our recent biodiversity report were for policymakers, whilst kind of approaching these issues around climate, biodiversity and food systems, is to really recognize the interdependence of supply side and demand side action. So if we think back to the cheaper food paradigm, we can see how sort of interlinked all of these issues are, and also how important it is to not just tackle one or the other, but really to look at both of those together. So for example, rather than just incentivizing consumers to shift their consumption, we also need to be incentivizing production side shifts as well in order to actually see those impacts on the ground. And related to this is to embed a food systems approach. So again, rather than just look at one issue in the food system, such as food waste, we really need to be looking across that spectrum and taking all of those key elements into account when coming up with solutions. And the final recommendation was to develop global guidelines, which really are quite missing, but very important. So these are along the lines of things such as responsible investment, dietary change, so maybe some global dietary guidelines, for example, and also around nature-based climate change mitigation solutions and how they really need to be maximized for climate change impacts and biodiversity impacts as well. And of course, in addition to national level action, there are a whole range of other things that can be done kind of subnationally or in partnership with corporations. So one example is a kind of transition farming approach where farmers partner with corporations, at least initially, to actually assist in some of those supply side or product side transitions. Of course, that would help to increase the availability and accessibility of plant-based options. And corporations could also commit to sales targets and menu changes in their institutes as well. And that also applies at the sort of municipal or city level. There's an awful lot that can be done subnationally, and this certainly shouldn't just be left to the national policy level. And there's, of course, a lot of things that individuals can do as well. We could, of course, eat more plants. That's quite an obvious one. We could also request food services to provide better offerings, and we could contact our political representatives about these issues as well. So if anybody would like any of those reports that I mentioned, I will paste these links in the chat actually. That would be a lot easier. And that is all from me for now. Thanks so much for being here. I really appreciate the opportunity to present this information today, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Helen. And I really liked what you said about, also this element of well-being and nature, which I think we've all realized during this pandemic is so crucially important. And also that, very solution orientated at the end there, which added a positive spin. So I have some questions here from the audience for you. So the first question I'm going to go for, it's an anonymous question, but it's someone that's concerned about food security. So, I mean, this is a narrative we hear a lot every time we talk about more sustainable food systems. The question is, can we actually set aside, at the same time, can we set aside land for biodiversity, use sustainable agriculture, but also produce enough food for everyone? I mean, this concern of food security, what would you say to this question?
Yeah, it's such an important issue, and there's so many different facets in food security, so it's quite difficult to give a sort of defining answer without kind of unpacking that a little bit. But generally speaking, we could actually feed. So if we look at our vegan scenario in that analysis that I just showed, that was actually feeding everybody a vegan diet by 2050. So taking into account population rise by that point, and also setting aside these massive areas of land for the regeneration of ecosystems. So I think that is a really good example of demonstrating how we could actually feed everyone and basically set aside these huge areas of land as well. In terms of organic, we see a similar thing where we can do organic production to feed everybody, but that would really require a shift towards plant-based diets in order to free up the land that would be needed to focus on food production, because obviously organic tends to have lower yields than conventional food production, so we do need more land to sort of produce enough food. And that basically requires us to shift to a more plant-based diet in order to actually have the amount of land needed to feed everybody on an organic diet.
Mm-hmm. And there's another point here that I think someone's picked up on. You were talking about reforestation, the importance of trees. There's someone here, let me just see, is there a name to this? John Davis would like to know your views on nut trees as an alternative protein source, presumably in this transition towards plant-based agriculture, which should also lock up more carbon, arguably, than other crops. Do we have to consider perennial crops and annual crops and trees and nut crops, things like that, differently, and when we're having this discussion?
Yeah, that's another great question, actually. I'm glad somebody mentioned nut trees, because it's something I often think about myself. I haven't seen an analysis that actually has this kind of agroforestry approach, where we're essentially growing some food along with native ecosystems. So I don't have any kind of numbers to show what that scenario looks like, but certainly, it just seems to make complete sense to me that nut trees would be a great thing to include in there. In terms of alternative protein sources, again, I haven't seen any analysis that kind of goes into nuts and what sort of proportion of protein that they could actually supply in a kind of global dietary scenario. But certainly lots of interesting research, I think, to be done in that space, and a really good point to bring up.
Definitely, maybe a point for further research. Lots to explore, clearly. We also have a question here from James O'Donovan. I think it's picking up on a point that you mentioned at one point about methane emissions compared to carbon dioxide emissions. So he has two questions. The first question is whether the IPCC takes into account emissions from soils specifically, rather than just emissions from agriculture, I suppose, on aggregate. And also he'd like to know if you can comment on how we can consider the exhalation of carbon dioxide from animals. Do you count that kind of in the same way as methane? How do you weigh those?
So the methane from animal agriculture is mostly from the ruminant animals, so that's cattle, sheep and goats, and that's emitted as a kind of byproduct of their digestive processes. So that's where the bulk of methane emissions from livestock comes from, so not really anything to do with soils. The other aspect is the manure decomposition, which obviously releases methane during that process as well. So it's really the direct emissions from the animals that are the bulk of the methane.
Okay.
And the second part of that question, sorry.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Go ahead.
I didn't quite catch the second part. Could you repeat that? There was a second question, I think, wasn't there?
Yeah, so the first one was about the soils and the emission of agriculture. The second one was about considering carbon dioxide differently from methane. Those are the two elements.
Yeah, I think there's definitely, that's a good way forward. I mean, even if we just think about the warming impacts that those two gases have and the time frame that those gases have the warming impact across, then I think we could really look at methane differently to CO2 from a mitigation perspective. So as I mentioned, those kind of temperature tipping points and getting close to 1.5 degrees, and really the only thing that is going to have a really big impact in the next decade or so on temperatures is actually removing or reducing methane emissions. Whereas CO2 is a much more kind of longer term, obviously absolutely crucial to reduce CO2 as well. I'm not saying it should be one or the other. We definitely need to tackle both, but in terms of the time frame that those gases actually have an impact over, then methane is really the focus point for the near-term temperature reduction, and CO2 is obviously the longer-term temperature impact. and both need to be tackled immediately. So there's no kind of, oh, we'll just wait for CO2 and tackle methane first. They both need to be tackled immediately, but definitely kind of from a temperature perspective, methane would have that near-term impact, which is really crucial.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. I think that's all the time we have for the Q&A, but don't go anywhere. I know you'll be coming back for the panel discussion very shortly. So thank you very much for your presentation.